In a quiet, walled villa on the outskirts of Rome, an old man spent nearly 3 decades of his life tending a small vegetable garden, playing chess, and watching the news. To his Italian neighbors, he was a courteous, soft-spoken gentleman of foreign birth, unremarkable in almost every way. But this old man had once been a king. His name was Mohammed Zahir Shah, and he was the last king of Afghanistan, the final ruler of a royal dynasty that had governed his country for nearly a century and a half. And from that modest villa outside Rome, over the course of those long, exiled years, he watched something almost unbearable unfold on his television screen. He watched his homeland, the peaceful kingdom he had once ruled, descend into one of the most catastrophic cycles of violence in modern history. He watched it be invaded, bombed, torn apart by coup after coup, occupied by a superpower, ravaged by civil war, and reduced from a quiet, hopeful nation into a byword for endless conflict. He watched more than 1 million of his former subjects die, and he could do nothing but watch. This is the story of what happened to Afghanistan's royal family after their kingdom fell, and it is unlike almost any other royal collapse in the world, because the fall of this particular monarchy is remembered by many not merely as the end of a dynasty, but as the end of an entire era of peace. Before the king was overthrown, Afghanistan was a functioning, modernizing, largely tranquil country. After he fell, it descended into 40 years of war that have still not fully ended to this day. It is a story that stretches from the founding of a nation that famously humbled the greatest empires on earth, earning the country its chilling nickname, the Graveyard of Empires, through the assassination of kings, the overthrow of reformers, a golden age of fragile democracy, and finally, a single bloodless coup that opened the gates to unimaginable suffering. And it is a story of a royal family scattered to the winds, of a king who came home at last only to die, and of descendants who would be forced to flee their country not once, but again and again, right up to the present day. Outside of Afghanistan, very few people know how it truly unfolded. So let me take you through the whole story, from the very beginning, because the details are far more dramatic, far more tragic, and far more consequential than you might ever expect. To understand how a king ended up tending vegetables in exile while his country burned, you first have to understand the extraordinary land he came from and the dynasty that ruled it. A land that had broken the ambitions of empire after empire, and a royal house forged in blood, betrayal, and the brutal politics of a nation that has never been easy to govern. The story of modern Afghanistan begins in the middle of the 18th century, in the year 1747, when a charismatic and brilliant military commander named Ahmad Shah Durrani united the fractious, proud, and warlike Pashtun tribes under a single banner and founded a great empire that stretched, at its height, across present-day Afghanistan and far beyond, reaching into Persia and deep into the Indian subcontinent. Ahmad Shah is remembered today as the founder of the modern Afghan nation, the father of the country, a conqueror whose empire was for a time one of the most powerful in all of Asia. But empires built on the shifting loyalties of independent tribes are fragile things, and over the decades that followed his death, the Great Durrani Empire fractured and contracted amid endless bloody internal struggles for the throne, as brothers, cousins, and rival chieftains fought one another for supremacy. And out of that long turmoil, in the early 19th century, a new and closely related branch of the ruling clan clawed its way to the throne, the Barakzai dynasty, the royal family whose fate this story follows, beginning with a shrewd, resilient, and formidable ruler named Dost Muhammad Khan, who seized power and set his family on the seat of Afghan kingship, where it would remain through wars and coups and assassinations for the better part of the next 150 years. The Barakzai came to power at one of the most dangerous moments in Afghan history, because their little kingdom had the terrible misfortune of sitting directly between two of the mightiest empires on the planet. To the south lay British India, the jewel of the British Empire. To the north loomed the vast, expanding Russian Empire. and both of these giants regarded Afghanistan as a crucial strategic prize, a buffer, a gateway, a chessboard on which they played out a decades-long struggle for dominance that history remembers as the Great Game. For the Afghan monarchy, this meant surviving in the shadow of powers that could crush them, and it led to a series of catastrophic wars that would define the nation's fearsome reputation. The most famous of these came in the middle of the 19th century, when Britain, alarmed by the fear of Russian influence creeping toward the borders of its Indian Empire, invaded Afghanistan to install a puppet ruler of its own choosing. At first, the invasion seemed a triumph. The British marched in, occupied Kabul, and set up their client on the throne, settling into the Afghan capital as though the conquest were complete. But the Afghans seethed under the foreign occupation, and before long they rose against the invaders in a fury that no one had anticipated. What followed became one of the most infamous military disasters in the entire history of the British Empire. In the bitter winter of 1842, a British and Indian force of many thousands, fighting soldiers together with the enormous column of camp followers, servants, and families who traveled with them, attempted to retreat from Kabul back to the safety of India, marching out through the frozen, treacherous mountain passes in the depths of winter. They were harried, ambushed, and slaughtered almost to the last soul in the snowbound gorges, picked apart day after day by Afghan fighters who knew every rock and ridge of that unforgiving terrain, and who fell upon the freezing, starving column without mercy. Of that entire retreating army of some 16,000 people, only a tiny handful survived to reach the safety of the British garrison at Jalalabad. By legend, a single exhausted, wounded survivor first rode in to tell the tale of the annihilation of an entire army. It was a stunning, almost incomprehensible humiliation for the most powerful empire on earth, and it cemented Afghanistan's legend as a place where great powers came to be broken, the graveyard of empires. Britain would invade yet again in later decades, and would eventually secure a measure of control over Afghan foreign policy, but it never truly conquered the country or held it down. And through it all, the Barakzai dynasty endured, bruised but unbroken. By the end of the 19th century, a ruthless and iron-willed ruler known as Abdur Rahman Khan, remembered as the Iron Emir, had brought the fractious country under a firm central grip, crushing rebellion after rebellion with a severity that became legendary, breaking the power of the rival tribes and chieftains, and forging the modern, centralized Afghan state through sheer, unrelenting force. He drew the borders that would define the country, played the British and the Russians against each other with cunning skill, and ruled his people with an iron fist that left a unified but deeply traumatized nation to his heirs. His successors would inherit a country that was, for the first time in generations, held together under a single strong monarchy, but held together by fear as much as by loyalty, its unity always fragile, always one crisis away from fracture. And in 1919, after the assassination of one king and the accession of another, the monarchy achieved its greatest triumph. A young, ambitious, and passionately reformist king named Amanullah Khan launched a brief but bold war against the British and won for Afghanistan its full and complete independence, freeing the nation at last from all foreign control over its foreign affairs. Amanullah became a national hero overnight, celebrated as the king who had finally cast off the last chains of imperial domination, and he set out, with enormous energy and idealism, to transform his newly independent country into a modern nation at breakneck speed. But here the story delivers its first great warning, a foreshadowing of everything that would come later, so exact that it reads almost like prophecy. Because Amanullah, dazzled by the sweeping modernizing reforms he had witnessed in Turkey under Ataturk and across Europe on a grand royal tour, tried to change his deeply traditional, deeply religious, fiercely independent country far too fast and far too forcefully. He pushed for the education and the unveiling of women, for the adoption of European dress in the capital, for new schools and new laws, and a wholesale reordering of society that struck directly at the heart of conservative tribal and religious life. To the modernizers of Kabul, it was a thrilling vision of the future. To the tribes and the religious leaders of the countryside, it was an intolerable assault on their faith and their way of life. And the country revolted. In 1929, a massive uprising swept Amanullah from his throne, and the reformer king who had won his nation's independence just a decade earlier was forced to flee for his life into exile, where he would eventually die, a broken and forgotten man, far from the homeland he had freed. For a few chaotic months, a rebel from entirely outside the royal family, a former bandit, even seized control of Kabul and held the throne, before order was finally, brutally restored by another branch of the Barakzai clan. The lesson was written in fire, and it would echo across the entire century that followed. In Afghanistan, those who tried to force change upon the country too quickly, or who lost the support of its tribes and its faith, could lose absolutely everything, no matter how mighty or how beloved they had once seemed. The man who restored the monarchy after Amanullah's fall was a distinguished and respected general named Mohammed Zahir Shah, a member of a collateral branch of the royal family, who took the throne in 1929 and worked tirelessly to stabilize the shaken and exhausted country, moving far more cautiously on reform than the fallen Amanullah had dared. But the violence of Afghan politics, never far beneath the surface, claimed him too. In 1933, Zahir Shah was assassinated, shot dead by a young man at a public ceremony at a school in Kabul, in an act of personal and political vengeance, cutting his careful reign brutally short after just 4 years, and plunging the monarchy once again into sudden crisis. And in that terrible instant, the crown passed, suddenly and unexpectedly, to his 19-year-old son, a quiet, bookish, and thoughtful young man who had just witnessed his own father's murder. That young man was Mohammed Zahir Shah, and he would become the last king of Afghanistan, reigning for the next 40 years, the longest reign of the entire dynasty, and the final chapter of the Afghan monarchy. For the first 3 decades of his reign, however, Zahir Shah was king in name far more than in fact, and he seemed to absorb, from the very manner of his father's death, a deep and lasting caution about the perils of power. Thrust onto the throne as a frightened teenager in the immediate aftermath of an assassination, he wisely allowed real authority to rest in the hands of older, more experienced relatives. First, his powerful uncles, who served as prime ministers and dominated the government for years, steering the country carefully through the treacherous waters of the Second World War, keeping Afghanistan strictly neutral and out of the global catastrophe that consumed so much of the world. Later, real power passed to his forceful, energetic, and deeply ambitious cousin, Mohammed Daoud Khan, who served as prime minister through much of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, and pushed hard for rapid modernization, for the advancement of women, and for closer ties with the Soviet Union to the north. Through all of this, the young king watched, listened, learned, and bided his time, a patient, cautious, and self-contained figure, content for years to let others hold the reins, while he quietly studied the delicate and deadly art of ruling a country that had broken so many who had tried to master it too boldly. And then, in 1963, Zahir Shah finally stepped fully into his own power. He dismissed his domineering cousin Daoud from the office of prime minister, and he set about a bold experiment that would define his legacy. In 1964, the king introduced a new constitution that transformed Afghanistan into a constitutional monarchy, a system in which the king reigned, but an elected parliament and a free-ish press and political parties could flourish. He deliberately barred members of his own royal family, including the ambitious Daoud, from holding the office of prime minister, hoping to keep the government in the hands of capable commoners rather than power-hungry relatives. What followed became known as the Decade of Democracy, and for many Afghans it remains, to this day, a cherished memory of what their country could have been. Because this was Afghanistan's golden age, a genuine, if fragile, era of peace, openness, and hope. Under Zahir Shah's calm and moderate rule, Kabul in the 1960s and early 1970s blossomed into a cosmopolitan and surprisingly liberal city. Universities filled with students, both men and women, studying medicine, law, engineering, and literature side by side. Women worked as doctors, teachers, professors, judges, and civil servants, and walked the streets of the capital in modern dress, some in skirts and blouses, their faces uncovered, moving freely through a city that felt, in those years, as though it belonged to the modern world. Foreign visitors and travelers passed through in growing numbers on the famous overland trail that ran from Europe to India, marveling at the country's dramatic beauty, its ancient bazaars, and its legendary hospitality. And Afghanistan gained a reputation as one of the most welcoming and enchanting stops on the entire journey. Cinemas showed films from around the world, radios played music, cafes and tea houses buzzed with political debate, and a comparatively free press argued openly about the nation's future. Diplomats, archaeologists, and aid workers filled the capital, and a small but growing middle class began to imagine a future of steady progress and prosperity. It was far from a perfect country, and it would be a mistake to romanticize it too much. The vast rural interior remained desperately poor, deeply traditional, and largely untouched by the reforms of the capital, and the gap between the modernizing cities and the conservative countryside was a fault line that would one day help to swallow everything. The parliamentary experiment was messy and often gridlocked. Political parties were never fully legalized, and the pace of real change frustrated many. But it was, by the standards of everything that came before and everything that would come after, a time of remarkable tranquility and promise. For those few precious years, it seemed as though Afghanistan might just find a path toward becoming a stable, modern nation, guided gently by a wise and unassuming king who had learned the hard lessons of his predecessors, above all the terrible lesson of Amanullah, and who refused, wisely, to push his country faster than it was willing to go. It is this Afghanistan, this lost country of peace and possibility, that older Afghans and their descendants still speak of with aching nostalgia, and it is the memory of this golden age that makes everything that followed so unbearably tragic. But the golden age was built on far shakier ground than it appeared, and its collapse, when it came, was swift and almost absurdly simple. The king's careful democracy had made powerful enemies. His decision to bar the royal family from real power had bitterly alienated his own cousin, the proud and ambitious Daoud Khan, who had been shoved aside and now watched from the sidelines, resentful and hungry to return. Economic troubles, a devastating drought and famine in the early 1970s, and growing frustration with the slow pace of the parliamentary experiment all eroded confidence in the government. And the ideological currents of the age, communism pushing in from the Soviet North, Islamism stirring in reaction, were beginning to pull at the fragile fabric the king had woven. The end came in the summer of 1973. Zahir Shah, now nearly 60 years old, had traveled abroad to Italy, partly to receive medical treatment for his eyes and partly to rest. And while the king was out of the country, his embittered cousin Daoud saw his chance and seized it. On the 17th of July, 1973, in a swift and almost entirely bloodless coup, Daoud Khan and his allies overthrew the monarchy. They abolished the throne that had ruled Afghanistan for nearly a century and a half, declared the country a republic, and installed Daoud as its first president. There was almost no resistance. The 40-year reign of Zahir Shah and the entire institution of the Afghan monarchy was swept away in a single night, while the king himself was thousands of miles away. Zahir Shah faced a fateful choice, perhaps the most important of his entire life. He could have tried to rally the many Afghans who still felt loyalty to the crown, to return home and fight to reclaim his throne, to summon the army and the tribes and plunge the country into a civil war between the king and his usurping cousin. He very likely had the standing to do it, and many exiled monarchs in his position would not have hesitated. But Zahir Shah was, above all else, a man who feared bloodshed and who loved his country more than he loved his own crown. He had spent 40 years steering Afghanistan away from violence, and he would not, even now, be the one to unleash it. And so, rather than drag his homeland into a war between cousins, he made the decision that would define his long exile. He formally abdicated the throne, gave up his crown without a struggle, recognized the new republic, and chose to remain quietly in Italy. It was a genuinely selfless act, and a deeply tragic one, because in choosing peace over power, in stepping aside to spare his people bloodshed, the last king unknowingly removed himself at the very moment his steadying, moderating presence would soon be needed most desperately of all. He could not possibly have known it then, but his quiet, dignified abdication marked the end of the last stable and legitimate government that Afghanistan would know for the next half-century. And so began the long exile. Zahir Shah settled into that modest villa on the outskirts of Rome, in a suburb where he would live for the next 29 years, surrounded by a small circle of family and loyal retainers, living a life of dignified obscurity on a fraction of the wealth and grandeur he had once commanded. He gardened, he played chess, he read, and he received the occasional visitor, Afghan exiles, journalists, the rare diplomat. He carried himself always with the quiet, courteous dignity of a man who had ruled a nation, but he made no grand claims and led no government in exile crusade to reclaim his throne, choosing instead to wait and to watch and to endure. Around him gathered the scattered members of his large family, sons and daughters, grandchildren, nephews and nieces, who built new lives in Italy and beyond, many of them growing up as Europeans, far removed from the mountainous homeland their grandfather had ruled, knowing Afghanistan only through his stories and through the terrible images that flickered across the evening news. For the exiled king, the hardest part of those long years was surely this, that he was forced to watch, in real time and in helpless silence, as the country he had spent 40 careful years shielding from disaster was consumed by the very catastrophe he had always dreaded. Because what followed the fall of the monarchy was a descent into horror almost without parallel in the modern world. Daoud's republic lasted only 5 years before it too was violently overthrown. In 1978, communist officers staged a bloody coup, storming the presidential palace and murdering Daoud along with much of his family, the very cousin who had toppled the king now slaughtered in his turn, a grim confirmation that the age of peaceful transitions was over. The new communist government, radical and repressive, plunged the country into chaos, and when it began to collapse under the weight of popular rebellion, the Soviet Union made a catastrophic decision. In December of 1979, Soviet tanks and troops poured across the border to prop up their faltering communist allies, beginning a brutal occupation that would last nearly a decade. Afghanistan became the bloody battleground of the Cold War, as Soviet forces waged a savage war against the Mujahideen resistance fighters, backed by the United States and others. Over the course of that war, more than 1 million Afghans were killed, and millions more were driven from their homes into vast refugee camps in one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes of the age. From his villa in Rome, the old king watched the graveyard of empires claim yet another great power, as the mighty Soviet Union bled itself dry in the Afghan mountains, just as the British had a century before. And still, it did not end. When the Soviets finally withdrew in defeat in 1989, the country did not find peace. It collapsed into a vicious civil war, as the victorious Mujahideen factions turned their guns on one another and reduced much of Kabul, the once cosmopolitan capital of the king's golden age, to rubble. And out of that chaos, in the mid-1990s, rose a harsh new movement of religious students who swept across the country and imposed one of the most severe regimes on earth, the Taliban. The Afghanistan of Zahir Shah's reign, with its universities and its women professionals and its cinemas and its fragile hope, had been utterly obliterated, buried under decades of relentless war. The peaceful kingdom was gone, seemingly forever. Through all of these long, dark years, the exiled king remained a quiet symbol of a lost era. And for many Afghans, especially those exhausted by decades of bloodshed, his name came to represent a nostalgic dream of the peaceful country that had existed before everything fell apart. He was not without his own brushes with the violence either. At one point during his exile, he survived an assassination attempt when an attacker, posing as a journalist, managed to stab him, and only a metal cigarette case in his pocket is said to have helped save his life. But for the most part, he simply waited, growing older, an old king in a foreign land, watching and hoping for a chance to see his homeland at peace once more before he died. That chance came, astonishingly, near the very end of his life. In late 2001, following the attacks of September the 11th, the United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan and drove the Taliban from power. And suddenly, as the international community scrambled to build a new government for the shattered country, the old exiled king became relevant again. There was serious discussion of what role he might play, and when a grand traditional assembly, a Loya Jirga, was convened in 2002 to chart Afghanistan's future, a significant number of delegates wanted to see the beloved former monarch restored to some position of leadership, even, some hoped, to the throne itself. After 29 years in exile, Mohammed Zahir Shah finally came home, returning to Kabul to an emotional welcome. An old man of 87 setting foot once more in the country he had been forced to leave a lifetime before. But Zahir Shah, ever the cautious and selfless figure, declined to reach for power. He understood that a fragile, war-torn nation did not need a restored monarchy or a fight over the throne, and he deferred graciously to the new political order, throwing his support behind the establishment of a republic under a new president. He renounced any claim to rule. In gratitude and reverence, the new Afghan constitution and the nation honored him with a special ceremonial title, Baba-e-Millat, the father of the nation, allowing him to live out his final years in Kabul as a cherished elder statesman and a living link to the country's last age of peace, but without any real political power. It was a poignant and fitting end for a man who had always placed his country above his own ambition. His homecoming, though, was tinged with sorrow. His wife and queen, Humaira Begum, who had shared his long decades of exile, died in Rome in 2002, just as the family's return was unfolding, and she was brought back to be buried in Afghan soil. And the old king himself did not have long. Mohammed Zahir Shah, the last king of Afghanistan, died in Kabul in July of 2007 at the age of 92, having outlived his kingdom by 34 years and having witnessed in his single long lifetime the complete destruction of everything he had spent his reign trying to preserve. He was laid to rest in the royal mausoleum on a hill overlooking Kabul, among his ancestors, home at last. His eldest son and crown prince, Ahmad Shah Khan, who would have been king had the monarchy survived, died that very same year, and with the passing of that generation, the direct hope of the throne faded quietly into history. So, what has become of the Afghan royal family since then? The descendants of the Barakzai dynasty, the many sons, daughters, grandchildren, and relatives of the last king, have been scattered across the world, living for the most part as private citizens in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, carrying royal titles that no longer command any real authority and that mean little to the wider world. Some built quiet professional lives abroad. Others devoted themselves to preserving the memory and the heritage of the dynasty from afar. The formal headship of the royal house passed down through the family after the deaths of Zahir Shah and his crown prince in 2007, but it became a purely symbolic inheritance, the leadership of a house without a kingdom, a claim to a throne that no longer existed in any form. There would be no restoration, no return to power, only the careful tending of a memory. Yet some of them chose to return to Afghanistan after 2002, during the years of the American-backed Republic, hoping to contribute to the rebuilding of their shattered homeland. They took part in civil society, in business, in public life and government, lending their family's still respected name to the fragile project of constructing a new and peaceful Afghanistan. For a brief and hopeful window of nearly 2 decades, it seemed that members of the old royal house might once again have a genuine place in their country, not as rulers, but as citizens, patriots, and servants of a new order, helping to build the peace their grandfather had always longed to see. But the tragedy of this family, like the tragedy of their country, was not yet finished. In the summer of 2021, the American-backed republic collapsed with stunning, dizzying speed as foreign forces withdrew and the Taliban swept back into Kabul and seized total control of the country once more. And so, in a heartbreaking echo of 1973, the descendants of the royal family who had dared to return were forced to flee all over again, abandoning their homes and their hopes, scattering back into exile, driven from their homeland a second time within the living memory of a single family. Twice in 50 years, the same royal house had been uprooted and cast out. Twice, the promise of a peaceful Afghanistan had risen and then collapsed beneath them. The peaceful kingdom of Zahir Shah now seemed further away than ever, a fading photograph from a vanished world. And the royal mausoleum where the last king lies buried on its hill above Kabul stood, once again, in a country ruled by the very movement whose eventual rise his overthrow had, in the long and bitter chain of history, helped to make possible. It is worth stepping back to grasp the full weight of what the fall of this monarchy actually meant. Because the collapse of the Afghan royal family was not merely the end of a dynasty, it was, in the eyes of many, the hinge upon which the entire modern tragedy of Afghanistan turned. Before 1973, Afghanistan, for all its poverty and its imperfections, was a nation at peace, with a functioning government, a growing capital, and a hopeful, if fragile, experiment in democracy. After 1973, it fell into an almost unbroken cycle of coup, invasion, occupation, civil war, and extremism that has consumed it for half a century and counting. The single bloodless coup that toppled the last king removed the one figure who had, for 40 years, managed the delicate and dangerous balance of Afghan politics without plunging the country into catastrophe. And once that balance was broken, no one was ever able to restore it. Whether the monarchy could truly have survived the ideological storms of the age, or whether its fall merely accelerated an inevitable collapse, historians will long debate. But the timing is undeniable, and it haunts the country still. The last age of Afghan peace and the age of the Afghan monarchy were one and the same, and they ended together. And the land itself, meanwhile, remained true to its terrible reputation, drawing in and humbling the greatest powers of the age one after another. The British in the 19th century, the Soviets in the 20th, and the Americans in the 21st. Each of them, in the end, forced to withdraw from the unconquerable graveyard of empires, leaving the Afghan people to bear the wreckage. There is something profoundly human and profoundly sorrowful at the heart of this story. It is the story of a gentle, cautious king who wanted nothing more than to spare his country the violence that had destroyed so many of his predecessors, and who, in the end, watched from afar as his country suffered the worst violence of all. It is the story of a man who chose peace over power, who abdicated rather than fight, who declined a throne offered back to him in his old age, and whose defining quality was a kind of quiet, self-effacing decency that is rare among rulers of any age. And it is the story of a family and a nation condemned to flee again and again from a homeland that could not find peace. Zahir Shah gave up his crown to avoid bloodshed and lived long enough to see rivers of it flow anyway. He came home at last, only to die. And the country he loved, the peaceful kingdom he had tended so carefully for 40 years, exists now only in memory and in the fading recollections of the old, a lost golden age glimpsed through the smoke of half a century of war. When you set the Afghan story beside the other great royal falls of the modern age, it stands apart in one devastating respect. The Russian Romanovs were murdered, their suffering horrific but swift. The Ottoman dynasty was expelled and left to wander in poverty. The royal family of neighboring Iran was swept away in a revolution that transformed the region. But the fall of Afghanistan's royal family was different, because it was not the family alone that paid the price. It was an entire nation, plunged by the loss of its steadying king into half a century of unbroken catastrophe. The last king of Afghanistan did not die in a cellar or flee into destitution. He died an honored old man in his own capital, called the father of the nation. And yet, his may be the saddest fall of them all, for he lived to see everything he had preserved destroyed, and he understood, better than anyone, exactly what had been lost. If you found this story as moving as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me keep telling these forgotten stories that shaped our world. And let me know down in the comments what you think. If Zahir Shah had not been abroad in the summer of 1973, if he had been in Kabul to stop his cousin's coup, or if he had chosen to fight to keep his throne, could the Afghan monarchy have survived? And could all the horrors that followed have been avoided? Or was the peaceful kingdom always destined to be crushed between the ideologies and empires of the age? I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.